Good afternoon. My name is Nora,
I'm Marcos.
I'm Chloe.
I'm Sophie.
and our project is a digital archive of the Portali and Lunette of Venice for cultural conservation.
To begin with, we're going to start with what is a portal and what is a lunetta. So, a portal is an architectural doorway typically found on historical buildings, while a lunetta is the decorative semicircle feature that is typically found above entryways, but they can also be found by themselves on the side of buildings. On screen is just like the highlighted what parts is part of the lunette and what part is part of the portal itself.
So, what makes Portali and Lunette important for us to pay attention to? Well, there's several ways that they are significant. First of all, they have historical significance, as in Venice, there was very harsh laws against self-aggrandization and any sort of self-promotion. However, an exception to this was decorating one's building, one's house. So these entryways became a way for the nobles and other elites to show off their wealth and family status. As we can see, this Portali on the left has a lunetta with a family crest that's going to show their reputation to anyone that passes by. Of course, nowadays, that's not how they're used, as now they've just been converted into normal homes. But they still hold important significance because they're still there. And now they are homes, businesses, and just normal restaurants. And the fact that they're still there gives Venice a very unique visual landscape that not a lot of other places have. And one specific portal that we'd like to point out is that of the Ospedale, which, being a hospital that used to be a church, it creates this very interesting, one study of the evolution of how things got converted from their previous uses to the modern day uses, but also it's very unique to, say, go visit a family member in a hospital, and instead of being met with cold walls, you're met with this grand Baroque entrance. And it's just a very specific feeling that you're not going to find in many other places, and we think that this makes this study important and meaningful to Venice itself and its cultural identity. So there has been one other project that has looked into Portali and Lunette, and that project was able to document 552 Portali and 71 Lunette. Our study expanded upon this, and we took another look, and were able to find 844 Portali and 487 Lunette. And this is just due to a more exhaustive search.
Now we're going to go into our methodology, and first we're going to start with data collection. So we used an exhaustive search to go through every street in Venice in order to look for each Portali and Lunette. And to do so, we created a mobile application in order to track each of these data points. On our next slide, we'll show screenshots of our survey and us using it to track Portali and Lunette.
Next up is portal location. So on the screen, we can see everywhere we documented where a portal was located. And as mentioned previously, we documented 844 portals. On the next slide, we have Lunette locations, which we documented 487 Lunette. And then this slide is just Portali with Lunette, as Lunette are most commonly found accompanied by a portal. And then for total number of these structures, because we found a few Lunette without a portal, we have 855. Moving on, we tracked the number of these structures in each individual sestri. We found that Castello had the highest number of portals with 214, while Santa Croce had the least number with just 49. We also looked into the density which sestries had the highest density of portals, and we found that San Marco had the highest, and San Polo also had a very high amount. And historically, both these sestries are very wealthy, and through our data analysis, we find correlation between the wealth and portals in a given sestri. For building types, we found that 45% 45% of the portales we found were on residential buildings. It's important to note that many of the residential buildings were once palazzos, which is why there's so many residential buildings that have portales on them. Next up is churches. Any church you can find, it's guaranteed to have at least one portal on it, if not way more. And then the third most common type we found was, portali to be found on, was palazzos. Once again, palazzos home to wealthy, like doges, so they often had portali to display their wealth and grandeur. And then this is just a map of the overall building type data.
So next we're going to move into the architectural classification. So in our study, we looked at 5 major architectural styles, being the Romanesque Byzantine, Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, and Neoclassical styles. Now, these are important to note not only because they convey specific historical information and which eras these structures were built in, but also the style is going to dictate the shapes and the materials and the features found on it, all of which can have an impact on how that structure is going to degrade and how it's going to get worse over time. So it is important for us to make note and correctly identify these to later see if there's any correlation with those and the degradation data. So through our study, we found that by far the least amount was found in neoclassical styles. And this is likely just because it was a relatively short era, and the portals in Lunette of that time period were as the archetype implies, not very ornate, so our study didn't really include them too much. The Romanesque Byzantine had the second most, and this is likely because during this period, Venice was still growing in its wealth and power. So while these structures were starting to pop up, they weren't at their full potential, and additionally, a lot of these would have gotten rebuilt later on, losing their original facades. Then we start to get into the Gothic, which is where Venice really starts to gather its power and wealth, and we start to see a much more higher concentration of Gothic portals. And this pattern continues well into the Baroque and the Renaissance, which makes sense as these were during Venice's golden age, where there's going to be the most amount of wealth and nobles, and therefore they're going to be able to build more intricate and more elaborate portali. And here's a map of the overall styles, and as you can see, they're very spread out throughout. There's not a particular pattern to which they arise.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we developed our condition assessment and our results from those findings. So we evaluated each structure by a 4-category condition index called the overall condition index. The first category is the cracking score on a 0 to 4 scale, with 4 being the worst score it could get. This portal in Lunette you can see here is a 4 on the cracking scale. It has a pretty severe and deep crack going through its center, with a staple going through the crack to try to stabilize it a bit. Next we have the surface condition score, evaluated based on the severity of deterioration on the surface or the development of these black gypsum crusts that you can see on this portal. Next is the missing and endangered features score, which we evaluated whether there were any damaged features or outright missing. What's interesting is actually most of the outright missing features were removed by people and not actually from degradation, as is likely the case from this crest on this lunette here. And finally, we counted the number of risk factors. This portal here has several, including evidence of flooding based on the development of those crusts right at the bottom, vegetation on the bottom and the top, and it is located in an alley, so it would have 3 risk factors. So this is a map depicting the distribution of portals and lunettes in good condition, so they're 1 or less. You can see here they're not particularly concentrated in one area. And then our next category is the 1 to 2. This is our largest category. Most of these are in fair condition, but do need some sort of attention. We generally found that a score of 1.5 or higher needs some sort of attention or restoration. Our second largest category is 2 to 3. This also is a category where restoration is definitely needed. It is very hard to get a score above a 3, just because of the nature of our distributions, and most of these do require some sort of attention. And finally, our smallest number is 6%, which is 3 to 4. These also are not concentrated, particularly in one area, generally just in the areas that have the highest density. But these do need significant care. We tried to look to see whether there was any area it was most concentrated in, and we found the means of each scores in each sestieri. We found that the lowest average was in Dorso Duro with 1.69, and the highest was in Santa Croce with 2.18. This is a difference of about 0.5, which we've determined isn't high enough to determine that there's any sort of pattern based on sestieri. However, we have identified patterns correlated with the risk factors. So you can see here is a chart depicting the counts of risk factors we observed, and you can see the highest we've observed is the proximity to canal or water and evidence of flooding or water damage, which is backed up by our pie chart here, showing that we've observed some sort of water-related risk factor at over 92% of surveyed features.
Now we're going to get into our deliverables. So first we're going to start with the standardized field records that we developed. And as we stated previously, we developed a mobile survey application which would allow us to survey all of the Portali and Lunette on the field very conveniently. And we were able to save our results to a repository to access later. And additionally, this was able to be standardized across across any structure that we could survey, which would be convenient for future projects to expand our scope to the surrounding islands or to any other structures. And then we're going to get into our data repository. And this is where all of our data was kept that we surveyed. So you can see all of the locations as well as the data points. We also took pictures of them, as we did mention previously.
Next up is our Venepedia pages. So we created Venepedia pages for the definitions of Portali and Lunette. The Venepedia pages also contain pages about each individual portal and Lunette we documented, and there's a ton of data on each page about those.
As I talked about earlier, we developed this condition index. You can see here a table that goes into a little more detail about how that's determined and how it distributes to get our score. This score is a great tool for researchers and future project teams because it can be used to track the condition over time and determine priorities for restoration, see how fast certain structures are degrading, where they're degrading the fastest, and overall can be a really great tool to use for future projects.
The last thing we created was an interactable app. And with this application, we were able to make a easy and accessible way to view all of our data. As you can see with the homepage, it shows the general patterns and the general amounts, as well as a map of all the points documented, and with little thumbnails of specific Portali. So if anyone is interested, they can click in and get the information for any specific one. If we click down the tabs, we can see that it includes a Explorer page where you can scroll through and find either any specific portal or Lunette that you might be interested in, or just look through and browse. And speaking of browsing, the gallery provides an excellent way to just look through and appreciate all the different types and works of art that are these doorways, which at their root are decorative artistic entrances. And we hope that this might inspire someone to get a little bit more involved in it or just appreciate them a little bit more. And then finally, the final tab just kind of gives a summary of the findings and trends in the data. And overall, we hope that this app provides not only just a interactive and interesting way to get involved with the data, but also just a useful resource for anyone interested in helping with the preservation or the conservation of these structures.
And now we'll move on to our recommendations and takeaways. So we interviewed Melissa Kahn from Save Venice, and one big thing she brought up is that building owners are responsible for maintaining their own Portali and Lunette on their buildings. And a big barrier to that is resources that are available. So we propose that there are more government programs available to give building owners these resources, such as providing a certain percent back from the money that they invest into restoring their architectural embellishments. Next, next we want to reassess previously restored buildings from 20, 30 plus years ago. In the same interview, she brought up that a lot of buildings that they restored 30 years ago haven't been looked at again, and especially ones that are threatened by risk factors have seen accelerated deterioration, and so we propose to look at them again. Additionally, a lot of Portali and Lunette in tourist hotspots are much more focused on than ones in residential areas, so we propose that restoration groups expand the restoration efforts across Venice rather than just focusing on the more tourist ones. And finally, prioritizing weather-adjacent structures or water-adjacent structures, because we found that water was a big risk factor threatening Portali and Lunette.
And finally, these are our final takeaways. So first and foremost, Portali and Lunette are important elements of Venetian heritage. We found through data analysis that the highest concentrations of Portali existed in historically wealthy areas. Additionally, a majority of the Portali we documented were located on private residences. And many of those Portali are in poor condition. And the last thing was most of this deterioration is due to water damage.
So we'd like to thank, of course, Fabio Carrera, our sponsor, and the Venice Project Center, along with Serendipity, for providing us the resources and guidance for this research. We'd also like to extend thanks to Grant Burrier and Natalie Farney, who were our advisors for this project and provided excellent advice and guidance throughout it. Additionally, Ali Reza was a technical support and allowed us to solve many problems throughout. And of course, special thanks to the experts that we have interviewed, which were David Sampson and Melissa Kahn from Save Venice Incorporated. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Yeah, a lot of it is possible through, since, as we mentioned, a lot of these families were building palazzos, and a lot of that information is actually documented, and you can look into it on like a case-by-case basis. And besides that, a lot of these you'll see do include coats of arms, as you can see up there, which just are emblematic of that family. However, many of these coats of arms don't exist anymore as they've got chipped away, because you can imagine if a new family moves in, first thing they're going to do is chip off the coat of arms of the previous family. But yeah, to answer your question, a lot of this information is actually out there. It's a little more difficult to get the information on the less important or the more commoner houses, which do sometimes include these, but it's definitely possible.